Yeah, and I think you're a great person to talk to about kind of holistically the scene because you're still involved with Immortals, and historically that was all one company until you guys split it up, right, into its different constituent pieces. Which, for those of you who don't know, are Immortals, the LCS team, the LA Valiant, which is the Overwatch League team, MIBR, which is the Brazilian brand that contains the Counter-Strike team and other teams. Also, I believe I don't know what rosters they're running currently.
Aren't you getting one for Valorant or something? Am I wrong on that one? Wasn't there
yeah,
like a Valorant team
MIBR is going to be in Valorant this year.
Yeah, so they're partnered in Valorant as well. So you've actually and historically, you guys were also in CDL for Call of Duty. So you have actually had participation in what has been and what is going to be, in terms of Valorant, every major professional scene. So I think what would be an interesting place to start is to kind of check in and see, as far as team leadership goes, we've seen first off, we had that totally open ecosystem that you mentioned with Counter-Strike, and that was also in League of Legends historically before the franchising era. Then we saw this big buy-in franchising era in Overwatch League and League of Legends. And for those of you guys who don't know, I'll just say this here. You would think, okay, some of these teams were paying like 20 million or whatever to enter Overwatch League. Those payments were supposed to be made over a period of years. And indeed, due to the pandemic and other bargaining that many of the teams did with Activision Blizzard, they didn't end up paying the full amount of those franchise fees.
The joke is, they actually appear to run the Overwatch League, how my energy company runs in the Netherlands, where they just send you an email like, you get this month's money back. Like, oh, cheers. I can stay alive for another month. Nice. That's how all works, apparently. Who knew?
Yeah. And so you also, as a team, receive some stipends from the developers as well, because the franchise model, at least on its face, was supposed to be this thing where you guys actually have an asset that you control. You can't get kicked out of the league. There's no relegation. It gives you safety to negotiate sponsorships, because when I ran a team, it was very difficult to negotiate sponsorships in League of Legends, because no matter what, they would cut down your money by saying, oh, you could get relegated. And they would do that to everybody, right? Because there was inherently a sponsorship risk with being associated with the game. So in theory, this was supposed to make more stable sponsorships for the teams. It was supposed to have an asset that increases in value, that would provide at least some, I think, fundamental underpinnings to the valuations of the team, because they actually own something that wasn't just a roster of players that could leave at any time, and a brand that, as we know in esports, fans don't really identify with brands. I mean, you might be an exception because MIBR is an extremely strong brand, but for the most part, it's mostly about the players and personalities rather than the brand, and the fans will follow those players to their new teams. And so we went through this phase, and we'll get to how esports could monetize better, because obviously it is at its core a marketing exercise for developers, which is a conflict of interest with the teams who are trying to create an entertainment product, I would argue, which is, part of the reason why Flashpoint was made. Anyway, then you have now a move to this new Valorant model, which is, we select partners, we will give you a stipend, but it doesn't guarantee you a spot. We help you because we like you and we want your brand within this league, give you some money so that you have a competitive advantage when it comes to capital, but it doesn't prevent someone else from spending a bunch of money and knocking you out of that partnership slot in for future years.
AKA the developer's wet dream.
I mean, I think it's better for fans too, if I'm honest. I like it from a fan
fuck
perspective.
The fans. I could give a fuck. But I mean, this is like a fucking developer's wet dream. It's Riot couldn't have conceived of a better method. Say what you will about Activision Blizzard, I think those leagues are a joke. I'm pretty much on record about that. But at least you own a slot where you're selling something. If you want to get out of the league, yeah, there's caveats. Yeah, Activision Blizzard take 25% off the top. Yeah, they can stop you selling if they want to. At least that was what the original contracts stated. This is something else. All these dickheads in Valorant for the past 2 years have been auditioning to Riot Games, and that's why they've all been doing, yeah, look at us, look how we run a cup, Riot, look at these great tournaments and all this value we could bring. We could be, and they absolutely fucking debase themselves for 2 years, sometimes even losing money so they could prove to Riot what great partners they would be, just for Riot to turn around and go, nah, actually, we're not letting you in. You don't get to come and play with the rest of us. Yeah.
Anyway, this whole setup I'm explaining so that we can so Tommy can opine on this, because let's start with the franchising stuff before we get into the particulars of Valorant. What was the thought process for you guys when because you bought in very early, obviously, to, well, how can I put this? You got denied from League of Legends because of actions from former employees, or lack thereof, lack of action. Let's put it that way. And then you turned around and bought an LCS slot later, but you were in the first wave of franchising for Overwatch League. So what was the philosophy behind why you wanted to be involved in franchising, and how has that progressed to this point? And do you still like this model now, and how has it changed?
So obviously, like, both the getting essentially kicked out of LCS by not getting into the franchising and Overwatch League franchising both happened before I joined the company. Like, and I can speak about the like general rationale, but I wasn't there at the time. So I think that goes back to the point you made about when you were running a league team. Like, most of our investors are like American family offices, ultra high net worth individuals. Like, they're the kind of people who also used to own or currently own traditional sports teams. Like, that's the model they can easily wrap their minds around. Like, that's the model that makes sense to them. It's very easy for folks like that, if they believe in gaming's growth in the long term in general, to wrap their minds around, like, this potentially being the next, whichever sports league, if you can build it to that point. And if you kind of think about how industries tend to evolve, like, if you end up getting to be one of the biggest names around now, decent chance that you can kind of stick around for long enough that it becomes very valuable. The only point is, like, you just can't burn too much money while you're getting there, because otherwise the returns might not be worth it. And so I think if you think about this from an American investor's perspective, I think the quote unquote franchise leagues are like the most obvious place to put your money. On the other hand, like, if you think about, say, like, investing in something that's focused primarily on Counter-Strike, that's a lot more like, say, the Premier League. You might just get relegated. Like, all of a sudden, like, your players leave, and like, you don't know what you get left with. We kind of faced that situation with MIBR, where the team was not doing well. This was in late 2019, early 2020. Like, the team was not performing. We had a bunch of like super popular names, like, some of the biggest names in the game, super popular players, like huge fan bases. And I think, generally speaking, what the community, at least, well, not the community at large, obviously, but the vocal part of the community, like, if you're reading comments on HLTV or Reddit, you would have thought that, like, the team is the players. And, like, candidly, like, we weren't sure. But what we did know is that we could not continue with that roster at the cost base that we were running at. And we kind of said, like, listen, guys, like, this is what we can do. Like, here's like a couple of options. Like, some of them involve like some of you, some of them involve none of you. But there's no situation where this gets rolled forward. And like, we're just going to have to do something here. And like, we could not get the players to go along with like any of those plans. And like, then we had the KNG experiment right after that. And like, they kind of thought again that they just like could push us for anything. And we're asking for like, like something completely outrageous in the context of like where we were in the world at the time and where they were in terms of just like how good they were and how long they had been that good. And we kind of had to decide between like, is the brand worth something, or is it just the players? Because like, if it's the players, then like, it's actually not worth anything. And so, it was hard to make that decision initially, because it's just like, if you're wrong, you're almost like killing the brand just overnight. On the other hand, like, even if you're right, then like, what does that help if you're still spending money on something that's not going to work out? And so like, it took us a while to kind of wrap our minds around that and decide. Once we got there, I think it became an easy decision. And from there, I think it's pretty clear that MIBR is, like you said, it's just one of those brands, and there's not that many that's like actually has like real value that people really care about deeply. I think that's why MIBR, without really even having been in Valorant for long, I think MIBR got its Valorant team maybe 6-8 months before the decisions were made for franchising, something like that. I think it was announced in December, and I think the final decisions were made in late August, if I recall correctly. Like MIBR did not, they didn't even play in the top tier league. They played in the second tier league. It was a good brand. Like, they operated a smart way. Like, the CEO of MIBR is great. Like, They have good staff. They have like good management principles. Like they don't just spend money for the sake of spending money. Like they don't just go get the biggest buyouts just to get the headlines. But they do have a brand that matters. Like they're sound operators. Like I think Riot saw that. I think Riot understood that they were going to be around in 3 years. Like they were not going to burn 5 million a year for 2 years and then come back saying like, hey, what happened here? Like, why aren't we worth $1 billion? And so, you know, I think there's definitely teams that kind of overextended in the way that you described, Richard. But I don't think that's, you know, and like, you know, we can argue, like we can talk about whether, you know, like to some extent game publisher are encouraging that. Like I certainly would be if I were in their shoes. Like, you know, it's shame on you if you do that, if you know, if you don't think that's worth the risk and you don't own that risk as being something that could easily happen. But I don't think that's the way to operate, certainly not the only way to operate or the right way to operate. And I think that's the kind of, you know, call it frost in the industry that I think is probably going to get taken down the most as just like general spending comes down in the next year or two. We'll see how long this takes. And I think like that's actually healthy for everybody around. And I guess to Monte, your question on the kind of on the franchise model, I think with MIBR, like, you know, Counter-Strike, I think is a little bit different in the sense that it's something where if you know, like, I think it's relatively easy if you have a good team that gets to play all these big tournaments to monetize it reasonably well. I think where people usually lose in Counter-Strike is where they have like a semi-good team that gets like 1 or 2 good tournament runs. They pay those players based on those 1 or 2 good tournament runs, and then all of a sudden you're kind of stuck in no man's land. I think the way you have to run a Counter-Strike team is either you're one of the best teams, in which case like there's going to be enough sponsors in like some of these categories, just given that there's no restrictions in Valve games. Essentially, that just, you know, you can run it in a smart way. And I think with MIBR, like our goal was obviously to try to build the brand around that, which was the thing that we actually got to keep beyond the roster, so that it wasn't only that. But on the, you know, with I think some of the teams, like it's, or I guess the other end of the spectrum is like you might be a team like ENCE, which ENCE has never taken investor money. Like there's never been $1 of outside capital that's come into ENCE. And so like what happens sometimes is like somebody comes in and like makes a big offer for a player and there's like little you can do if the player wants to go. Like you can deny them, but you know, you guys know how that goes if a player actually wants to make that difficult. But those are the kind of the decision spots where I know of teams that have been in similar spots. Like there's even another Brazilian team that I think was put in that spot by us when we were looking for different players. And like many teams choose to raise money at that point. And I think for that team, by the way, it has worked out, at least so far pretty well. But like those are the decisions. There's also teams that just like want to, you know, that there's teams that are like the sexy teams that have the best, you know, try to have the best teams and the coolest teams and the most popular players, etc. And like that can work if you can build like real brand value for yourself that stays. But as I think Monte said earlier, like I actually think this is one thing where gaming has been ahead of the curve vis-a-vis like traditional sports is people have always cared about the players more than the teams. Like now, if you think about traditional sports, like people don't give a shit where KD plays. They want to watch KD. Like people don't care really where LeBron plays. Like they want to watch LeBron. It's the same in like all these things. Like
it's like the joke.
That's why whichever like shitty Saudi
I know the
Arabian
joke that
team,
Maui loves to use, dude, is that one for LeBron where you say, I'm not a Heat fan. I'm a fan of where he at. That's what you say about LeBron if you're a fan of LeBron. Whatever team he's on, you're going to be a fan of. It's a good line. It's a good line, though, isn't it? It is a good line.
Maui for coming up with that.
But that's why that Saudi Arabian football team just paid like, you know, like 500 million to get Ronaldo for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Because people will like, there's still people who will follow. There's still people who will watch just because he's there, regardless of like which team it is.
Yes. By the way, as an aside, since you were talking mainly about Counter-Strike in your example there, right? Obviously, there is no Flashpoint anymore, and there's no tournament, there's no rivalry, etc. Blah blah blah. We're in essentially like the pre-Flashpoint ecosystem, but and I know it just never gets any credit, but clearly fucking upgraded and influenced by what Flashpoint did. Like for example, everyone out there in
teams now,
mate, those Louvre teams, they can just go and fuck themselves because those guys act to me as though like, ha, you were wrong. It's like you got a better deal because of us, you fucking fucking moron. But okay, I mean, I would just say thanks to someone like that myself. But hey, who are we, right? And the small amount of those millions of dollars.
Negotiations now that there's no one else to go to. Yeah,
mad, isn't it? So I wanted to ask Lopez along those lines because I saw it was only a few months ago, dude. There was some sort of news article where they implied that like the cut that teams get from like the Louvre agreement now is like pretty good, and if you're smart, you can like almost get like most of your team's running costs of it. People tried to play this angle off, and I noticed, by the way, this story just came and it was like a blip on the radar, and I was like, if this was real, this should be like the greatest breaking news of all time. Like, you've cracked the code to CSGO. People are now making all that. So I noticed like that's, by the way, spoiler if you're a fan, like I'm hinting it can't be true. So what I want to ask you all, essentially, this is the question, Tommy. What Flashpoint was set to address all those years ago in 2020, are those same questions still posed? Like, is there the same issue with how team orgs extract value from Counter-Strike? Are the margins still as bad? Has it improved? Are they like Louvre? Have you heard they are better now and it's sort of somehow evening out? What would you say to that sense? Because people try to make it sound like CSGO's great again as a result, Well,
I've seen some reports of what the Louvre agreements team get paid. I think Richard might have leaked some of those, I think.
Yeah, I leaked the original contract, yeah.
Yeah, so I think like some of that has gone publicly. Like we were obviously part of those negotiations until late 2019. I don't remember at what point. Contrary to popular belief, at least in the certain offices of a Cologne-based company, I actually have no idea what ENCE makes from that agreement or like what the other teams make. So like I don't know what. I remember like the original percentages, and I think there's been some leaks of like what some teams made. So like. I think you can infer the top teams make somewhere between like $500,000 to $1 million a year.
I think that was always the implied, yes.
Yeah. And so like
the problem I have with that, by the way, just as an obvious, since he put the number out there, let's say it was $500,000 to, well, we all know Monte cost $600K, and that was just to buy the fucking players. So like, yeah, go ahead. These numbers aren't checking out, is what I'm telling you.
Yeah, and so like, look, I think there's teams that probably, if they're on the upper end in a certain year, make like, let's just say like $750 a year. And they have a couple of sponsorships, like they can probably do reasonably well if, this is a couple of ifs, they run what's now become the popular model, which is that you have a couple of very expensive like superstar players, and then you have a couple of youngsters who you hope to develop. And, that's kind of the only way you
develop
can
also is a code word for pay less, pay a lot less than the
obviously.
Just so we all know where we're at.
Good euphemisms.
For every device in an IP at $30,000, you need Ninjas Junior or whatever the
Z or ZTR, whatever that guy was called. Yeah, exactly.
And that's how you bring the blended cost down. Like I think that's what absolutely has to happen. I think with EPL, because they did the expansion year or two ago, I think like there must have been anti-dilution payments. I think that's what it said in the original document. So I'm sure, just given, not to go into discrepancies in those size of those payments, but just given the reported amounts, which I think also might have come out of Richard, like that's a pretty good chunk of money to share between those teams. So like right at this second, I think things are probably going well. I think the challenge with that model is without relegation and without like more punitive penalties, which we also could not put in place for Flashpoint, by the way, like we tried, could not get those done in the end. And I think that's ultimately like perhaps the biggest reason that the entire thing failed. You just end up with like some of the teams that you have in EPL just have no place being in EPL, candidly. It's like, like EG's won like 2 games and, like 3 years, 6 seasons or something.
Finished bottom of the group 3 times out of the last 4. And like you say, I think they've won a total of like 2 games.
Yeah. And so like, I think like, I just don't know how to make that model work, because I don't know how the open, like unless you have a fully open ecosystem, but you just also happen to be ESL and you essentially have complete market, just like complete monopoly in the market. Like I don't know how you can make that work on the tournament organizer side, because if we go back a couple of years when we had more TOs competing for the calendar, like nobody was running enough events except ESL so that their like, fixed cost base could be amortized over all those different events. Now, somehow ESL like way overspent on all that anyway, but nobody else even had a chance. Now there's fewer of those events, but I think, ESL somehow has a larger portion, I think, of the calendar. Blast, I actually think, has the best product out of anybody in Counter-Strike. I think like I think Blast is like by far the best operator for viewers. But somehow like they just can't, like their format is horrible. Like it's just like this years-long group stage with like a couple of games that matter that like come up randomly with no build-up. somehow they get no incremental time on the calendar. Like they can't push for it, can't negotiate it for it. Like I'm sure because of ESL. And they're kind of stuck in this no man's land where like I don't know what they can do besides like expand to other games. And I don't know how anybody else could now come into the industry. And so like I think you kind of inevitably end up in a place where it's like more ESL, because I don't know how you can kind of solve around that. And like in that future, Duncan, and like what we were saying at the time in some of those FP negotiations is like, sure, it's fine to negotiate now and go with ESL, but like if this fails, like who's putting up the alternative in like 3 years or 5 years when they have to pick up the option and figure out like what the next guaranteed revenue share payments are? Because if they're not monetizing at a pretty good level at that point, like you're not keeping up the MGs. For as long as you have the MGs in place, like you're getting paid decent money, but who knows what happens then? Like it just comes down to
G
whether
just
you hit
means
the
minimum
growth
guarantee
projections.
if you're a fan, by the way. It just means what
Right.
they agree at a minimum to be in
So-
to be in the Louvre agreement. So yeah.
I mean, as far as Blast is concerned, I think their current status is a relic of the ESL era where they were devouring the whole calendar because they were, a publicly owned company or owned by a publicly owned company. And they were trying to just maximize viewer hours at the lowest cost possible. And they were using their monopoly basically just to bully people, whether it was Blast or whether it was Flashpoint. Now, obviously, their mandate, I think, has changed pretty dramatically since they were acquired by the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. And I think what's, to your point about ESL expansion, it's going to be really difficult for other people to compete with ESL because their main goal has gone from pinch every penny to spend lavishly for market share over a long period of time. Like it's completely shifted what their goals are. The only thing they care about is audience acquisition. They will lose a ton of money in order to grow the esports audience as much as they can and the ESL audience for a payoff 10 years down the road. They have infinity money for all intents and purposes. And I think as far as Blast is concerned, they already are expanding into other games. They recently acquired the entirety of the Rainbow Six circuit from Ubisoft. So I think that was probably a pretty big win because the developer is going to pay them to do that. But they were bidding on that process as well. So
didn't they also do something recently with Valorant? I think they did like a Valorant tournament last year or something. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah,
I thought they did something, right?
Fortnite as well. So like they've been pushing into other games.
So yeah, but I think you're right because Blast had to create this format and these windows within the calendar because of ESL's monopoly. And I don't know if they had very many good options. It was like, and also frankly, because of Flashpoint, like we were in competition for slots on the calendar with them as well. And so they had to create a plan which may not be changeable now that they have sold these franchises or these partner slots. And they had to fill in these holes in the calendar, which are, a week here, a week there, which is why their schedule is just so split up over everything. I'm sure they would rather not have what they have either. I don't think they would say it's ideal.
Well, the funny thing about the league structure is that not only is it clearly from an esports fan's perspective, I think it's like pretty definitively clear that people prefer tournaments to leagues in esports. Like yes. I don't know that you can make the counter argument at this point.
Even Riot's coming around to that one, mate. Like in League of Legends, they're making it into tournaments now instead of leagues. Basically.
Yeah, I think that's just in agreement. But like if you think about like a franchise league, like an EPL, and you want it to feel like everybody is competitive, it would actually be better for you to just host tournaments rather than like a league twice a year. Because what I've always said is what you actually want if you're running a team is you don't need a team that's always in the semis. You don't need a team that's always like in the quarterfinals and goes out. In fact, like that's bad for you. What you would like is like high variance. Like it's fine if you go out in groups and dead last, bum out in 2 games every once in a while, so long as you also have the run where you make the semis or whatever. Because like that's what actually keeps the fans excited is the variance. Like it's not interesting for anybody to watch you finish in top 8 every single time. And so that I think is what actually the admittedly like very robust tournament structure of EPL, like group stage, best of 3s, etc. Like, yeah, you'll probably find out like who the better teams are, but like that's not great for the teams who are not competing for the, like those are the teams that end up looking horrible in that structure.
EPL, I think the counter argument to this is always like, well, the teams want a certain minimum number of games so that they can sell sponsorships and say, hey, we're gonna have we definitely are going to be there for X number of days on the broadcast every year, as opposed to the high variance where if you have a lot of tournaments and somebody flops out early on. So I think the thesis behind EPL is that it's a stabilizing factor that the teams demanded in order to get sponsorships,
Not
right?
just teams,
I-
though.
I actually disagree. Richard's probably gonna say the same thing, but like I think you can guarantee the teams the same number of days because the teams that bum out in groups play 5 games a season, and so like you could do that over 2 tournaments.
That's
like
fair.
4 tournaments a year. Like that's not the problem. I think it's that all the TOs similarly compete for the players' preferences, and the players, no matter how bad or good a team is, they will always think that if they play a best of 9 million, they're the ones who win. It's like the Michael Jordan quote, like, I never lost a game, I just ran out of time. Everybody thinks that, no matter how bad they are relative to who they play against. Anyway, I probably also thought that.
With ESL as well, specifically the EPL example, it is a deliberately bad format by the conception of ESL themselves, because they want to occupy. It runs for fucking 2.5 months. They want it to run for 2.5 months.
It used to take a week to do one group, if you remember that format. Yes.
Yeah. Why? Why do they want it to run for that long? Because hours viewed is a super important metric in the world of sponsorships, and this is one of the important ones to TOs. So it doesn't matter how good the content is, it doesn't matter how good the games are, it doesn't matter what the peak viewership is, it just matters how many hours of slop did we serve up over the 2.5 month period. And so it just sits there like a fucking tumor on the fucking CS calendar. It's garbage. Like everyone knows what would work in CS. We would have a number of tournament organizers that could all play nice in the sandpit, and we would have a recognized circuit where there was a significant event each weekend or every other weekend, and it would be like the tennis circuit or the Formula One, which everyone loves all of a sudden. It would be like that. And like Tomi is saying, you would have a tournament, and then that winner gets this and gets X amount of points towards the major at the end of a 6-month cycle, and on and on and on you go. And we don't do that because we've allowed certain TOs to essentially dominate the calendar in certain games, ESL being the big offender in CS. I mean, the crazy thing about Blast is, right? So Blast are competitors to ESL, but they cannot be competitors to ESL with how their business is scaling at the moment. They're in the toilet in terms financially. And so that even if ESL, something bad happened to them and they disappeared tomorrow, Blast couldn't fill the void. They wouldn't have the infrastructure. They wouldn't have the money. So instead, ESL and Blast have got together and they've sort of agreed we'll negotiate the calendar spots and no one's going to be too much of an asshole about each other. But it's just like Schillinger and Adebisi and Oz, like making a fucking temporary alliance. One's going to shank the other eventually. And for me, where this story ends, the Savvy Gaming Group, if Blast ever get their shit together and look like a genuine threat, Savvy Gaming Group will buy Blast. And it'll just
I had a question. Maybe I can springboard off that. Because I want to actually ask Tomi exactly that question. We're doing it abstractly, but I'm going to use a specific example. The question I have, because it's actually part of a bigger question, which is one area I'm a bit suspicious about esports myself as an industry, is if all these companies are worth these massive valuations, and if, as you say, Tomi, it's like being able to buy the Dallas Cowboys, but in the 1970s, who the fuck wouldn't do it? It'd be getting billion. If that was all true, then where are all the people buying the companies? Do you know what I mean? Like, why hasn't someone bought any why hasn't FaZe Clan been fucking bought? Why does no one buy an Overwatch League spot from anyone else? Why does, no one does any of these things. It's the first person always. And then even though I'm told the value goes up, no one ever wants to get in on it before it goes to a billion, bazillion. So on this exact example, that's the real question I actually have, Tomi. Unless somehow maybe like fear of Valve and the fact that they are the like actual IP holders in CSGO. Aside from that, why don't the Savvy Gaming Group just buy Blast and basically go like, right, well, that's the whole scene on lock, crush the margins, and we can just do whatever the fuck we want with this scene? Like, the joke is, by not buying Blast, surely they just waste their time like bidding against essentially what could be themselves if they just bought that company for what would essentially be pennies on the dollar if we're talking about this massive industry we're going to have. Why do you think they don't do that? Why don't more people buy it in that sense? What do you think?
Well, I'll answer the savvy question first because I have a more direct answer on that, I think, and then I'll talk about like assets more generally after. But I think with regards to like why doesn't savvy under the same ESL face it umbrella by Blast, my guess is that the savvy folks are not the people who are like I'm sure they're like suggesting things and like they're the ones who make the ultimate decision, but like I'm sure that the ESL phasic folks, like they sold a dream and selling the companies, and that dream probably wasn't like buy us for this record amount of money, and then also, by the way, buy our competitor because we can't beat them. And so, like, I don't think that was the sales pitch. And so it's probably more like you give us money and like we'll crush everybody. And so like that's what they're doing, or you know, that's the like strategic plan that they're
just to put it in
on.
context, Tommy, there was an interview with Brian Ward the other day. They did this thing on Esports Insider where they like everyone give their end of year predictions, and Brian Ward is the face of the Savvy Gaming Group. He's still on the we can be bigger than football bullshit.
Oh, fucking hell. In 2022, why are you doing that?
Yeah, I know. Like, literally just had a World Cup as well.
I know.
He's fucking mental. Like, you know, yeah. So sorry, anyway, continue.
Yeah, I mean, look, by the way, like, there is a day when gaming will be bigger than all these sports because, like, kids don't play sports. Kids play games. And, like, when the kids who are 5 today, when none of them play sports today, they all play games. When they're 70, like, there's not that many people left who are going to care about
Sure, because we're going to meet them on the way down, right?
You know, like, that's...
exactly.
But that's, you know, that's many years away. Like, like my dad is never going to start watching League of Legends, like no matter, or Counter-Strike.
Oh, no. It's like that old joke.
It is.
I can't remember what the term is, but there's a premise for when, like, if you pick your dream, like Hollywood starlet, there actually is a point in time where she might sleep with you. But the question is, by that point, would you want to sleep with her? That's the old joke. Because if she's like 58 years old, it's not really that great, is it? You know, go on.
No, my point is, I actually do believe that eventually gaming will be as big as today, like sports are. But it's going to take until the people who are in their like 60s and 70s are people who grew up playing games. And like we're decades away from getting there. Like just now, some of my friends from like my childhood, like who used to play Counter-Strike with, or like who used to play other games, like they'll occasionally still watch like the majors. Like they'll message me to like ask about like what's going on, something. But like that's not that many people. Like most of our friends did not play games at that time. And so like it's not my peer group who is going to be old enough. So it's people who, you know, maybe it's the people who are now in their 20s. When they're in their 70s, like you're kind of near saturation, just in terms of like the demographics of the market. But like that's how long it's going to take. And the sports that are going to suffer first are not the most accessible ones. Like soccer is not the sport that's like suffering from youth participation. It's like the sports that are very expensive, that are like hard for people to get into, like hockey suffer, you know, like people don't have money to play hockey. Like it's
dude,
like,
this all sounds
like
fucked
upper
up.
Middle class sport.
But low key, we actually should, if you want esports to get really successful, ourselves should be the ones pearl clutching about CTE in the NFL and being like, it's really a disgrace to endanger your own children. You should just be doing something safe, like play a video game. We should all just be cunts and just ride that like a politician would. Yeah, exactly.
It really should be flag football.
This way,
better
by,
for
by,
anybody.
by the time esports is ready to beat football, we'll all be beings of pure light. Like we won't care about sports. That's my opinion. So
with regards to the second part of the point that you made about asset valuations in general. So generally, everybody knows, like, you want to buy a company that's public, like you pay some hefty premium to buy it from everybody. But that's because you have to buy everybody out. Like there's usually some, like, you know, most people, like, you know, there's a bunch of people who would sell at like today's prevailing price. And then there's people who would, you know, sell at like small bump above and then a small bump above. Like if you want to clear everybody, you have to pay this like massive premium for everybody because you can't just like slowly buy up. Like that's not how exchange rules generally work. Like there's a threshold after which you just have to make an offer for everything. On the other hand, if you're a private company, it doesn't actually matter if, I mean, this is kind of like how some of the shit coins in like the FTX drama played out. Like if Richard pays me for like my Tomi coin, for one of them $10, and I have 1 billion of them, like, sure, I could say that this is worth like 10 billion. That's like the FTX thing with like some of the shit coins that they created that they used to, like, you know, loan Alameda Research a bunch of money and kind of like, you know, defraud everybody who put money into the exchange. Similarly, like, it doesn't matter if, you know, if you're running whatever like highly speculative thing. In this case, like, let's just call it, you know, say an esports team. Like, it doesn't matter if there's a bunch of people who don't think it's going to work out, because you just need like the people who will give you the amount of money that you think you need. And like, that's why in this context, like in like a weird way, you actually kind of have like an illiquidity premium. So, or a minority premium. So instead of paying a premium for a takeover, where, you know, you might pay 30, 40% over like the market cap to buy a company and take it private, you actually can typically find people who will pay you more for a small part of the company. So put another way, like it's easier for me to start the Tomi Co tomorrow and raise 100 grand at a 10 million valuation than to raise $1 million at $5 million valuation. Because it's just a lesser amount of money. Like it's easier to locate 500, like, you know, 100 grand than 500 grand, or 100 grand than 5 million, or whatever. And so like you can actually see this play out interestingly, because there's a couple of teams that are listed publicly. So Richards at FaZe Clan earlier, like obviously traded horribly. Astralis is another one that's been public for just over 3 years now. I think their IPO was in 2019 December. Like they've always traded very poorly. Like you could actually go buy Astralis at a nice premium, sell it for what the LEC slots have sold recently, and keep the Astralis brand, the Blast slot, the EPL slot, and the Counter-Strike team for free, and you would probably have like a decent business left over.
You would.
Now,
yes.
now, like, you know, the management team, obviously, like they own a huge chunk of it. They wouldn't sell, but like that's how depressed the valuation is. Like if you look at Overactive Media, like their market cap is something like 20 million.
It's the Splice people, if people don't know it yet.
Yeah.
Mad Lions now.
It's the Toronto group. Like their market cap is something like, you know, 10, 15, 20 million, like absolutely nothing. And it's because it's the reverse in that. Like if you're in the private markets, you need to find some people who believe that and they'll give you the money. But like there's all these other people who just want to sell. And like if the supply and demand is such that you can get lesser amount of money at a higher valuation, you actually end up with very depressed public valuations, which is what we've seen here. And so that's why I think generally what you see is teams raising money at higher valuations. Like let's set aside whether that's smart or not for a second, but you see teams raising money, increasing amounts of money at higher valuations rather than takeovers. Because it's actually harder to raise that bigger chunk of money than to just put a little bit at play at whichever.
Just buy in as a
like.
minority ownership instead of buying the whole company is what you're saying. Yeah.
It's easier if you're 100 Thieves to find, you know, however much money you want to raise than for somebody to find, you know, half the amount that 100 Thieves is valued at to buy, you know, not like a comparable team, but like a slightly smaller team.
Yes.
And so it's that the valuations have gotten sufficiently high that it's actually hard to raise that amount of money. And combined with the fact that when you buy sports teams, what you typically do is, you know, the commandeers are supposedly going for like 7 billion. I think that's the most recent report. Like that's going to be probably, my guess, it's going to be something like 2 billion of equity and 5 billion of debt. And it's going to be all financed off the future media rights deals. And so really you're paying 2 billion for a team that's worth 7 billion. If you're buying Cloud9, I don't know what their actual valuation is. Like I think Forbes put it at like 500. Like you're paying 500. Like you can't put debt on it because none of these, I think Cloud9 actually might be profitable, but like not meaningfully. And so like you can't put debt on these companies. And so like if you see a sticker price of 300, the price is 300. If you can buy an NHL team for 500, you might actually pay 100 and just have debt for the rest. And that's the other big difference in these companies, because it's weirdly stuck between like these kind of like mature valuations of like these things are worth a lot of money, but they're not cash flow positive, and there's no like big centrally generated revenue piles that you can put debt on. And that's like the weird challenge in how the financing works in the market. That's like, it's not unique, but it's like a weird combination of like different markets.
By the way, just as an aside, because obviously some of this is a bit dry in terminology, I thought I'd just mention something for pure comedic relief that I saw at the beginning of the show, which is I hate Twitch chat because I find it's just full of morons. That's why I'm going to bring it up, because I saw a comment at the beginning of the show that was amazing, which will be lost to the ether because Twitch chat, you know, obviously people are watching the YouTube version without the chat replay, right? So I saw at the beginning of the show, right, some fan, a random name on Twitch chat, actually did write in the Twitch chat. Are you ready? He goes, he proposed a hypothetical. He said, if Sam Bankman free of FTX. Are you ready? This premise is so amazing. He goes, let's say he smuggled away like 5 billion or something. Do you think there's any way that still finds its way to, like, you know, TSM and LCS now? It's like, brother, you're like fucking Tiny Tim in like A Christmas Carol. You fucking clown. What? Why would he do that? If he'd stolen the money anyway, why would he then just go ahead and pay TSM and LCS? That just for pure comedic relief alone. I thought I had to mention it. It's too good, isn't it? It's too good. It's too good. Why?
See more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, you know, be a pleb and don't.